arms and the man, I sing of Troy. I've now finished Virgil's Aeneid, kind of the third in this trilogy that I've sort of invented, following the Iliad, the Odyssey, and now the Aeneid. Now, of course, the Aeneid was written 700, 800 years after the Homeric epics had been written down, and it's written in Latin. It's written by the Roman poet Virgil, but it sort of follows the story and is very much now I made fun of the Odyssey as being fan fiction of the Iliad. This is 100% fan fiction of both the Odyssey and the Iliad. But like I said, it is different in that it was intentionally written down. I don't think it was meant to be a song like the Homeric epics were. I think it was just meant to be a poem written in verse that could be read, probably could also be sung. But I think its intentionality is what sets it apart from the Homeric epics, where they had been part of an oral tradition that eventually got written down, and the form that we have of them today is not necessarily the form that the original creator, this Homer, if he existed or they existed, intended, whereas this is very much what Virgil intended, word for word. Well, this version is an English translation, but still. So I said it's very much a fan fiction. It's sort of a love letter to the Homeric epics. The first half of this is very much the Odyssey, and then the second half is very much the Iliad. We have sort of a battle, a war, a sequence of battles between these two different people. It follows the story of Aeneas, as you can guess from the title, who was a character in the Iliad, and he was the one that was promised to sort of survive this whole thing and carry on the sort of the Trojan line after the Greeks, the Achaeans, destroyed it. And that's what this story is all about, is how Aeneas survives and takes the surviving Trojans with him to Hesperia, or the Twilight Land, which is Italy, and founds what becomes the city of Rome. So, of course, Virgil is a Roman poet writing in the time of Augustus, I think, so the late 1st century BC, so right around 2,000 years ago, when Rome has just transitioned to an empire, or at least has transitioned from a republic. It sort of had an empire for centuries at this point, but a sort of a monarchical empire. And Rome wants to connect itself, historically, culturally, to the Homeric epics, which even to the Romans are, like, the Romans really look up to Greek culture. So they're looking at ancient Greek culture and they're like, how can we fit ourselves in there? And this is part of it. Now, Virgil didn't come up with all of this on his own. He didn't just make this up. There had been a tradition. I think Livy, which I read, Livy, Ab Orbe Condita, his History of Rome, came out not too long before this. They were contemporaries, but it was before this. And it talked about how Aeneas was sort of the progenitor of the Roman people. So Virgil didn't just make this all up, but he did sort of draw on mythologies and pseudo-history of Rome and created this epic to sort of firmly link Rome with the Greek and Homeric tradition. So much like in the Odyssey, where we have Odysseus telling his story to the Phaeacians after he is shipwrecked there, in this we have Aeneas telling his story to Dido of Carthage. So the dates get really messy around here, because Rome was founded in 753. Troy falls at the end of the Bronze Age in like the 1250s BC. Carthage was also founded in like the 800s BC. How does this all fit? Who knows? But Aeneas has landed in Carthage, sort of semi-shipwrecked, with a whole bunch of other ships, with a whole bunch of other Trojans, and talks to their queen Dido. Carthage had been a Phoenician colony. Dido had fled Phoenicia, Sidon, I think specifically, or maybe Tyre, and had founded this new city on the North African coast. And as she's sort of building the city up, Aeneas and the Trojans show up, and he tells her the story of the fall of Troy. So we get the fall of Troy through the eyes of a Trojan, of Aeneas. And the imagery and the language in this one, I don't know if it's just the translation versus the translation I read of the Iliad and the Odyssey, but it is very beautiful. The language used and the imagery and the vocabulary and just everything makes it a really great read. So we see the fall of Troy through Aeneas's lens, and everything collapsing around him and him rushing out to fight the Achaeans. And we see the death of Priam as he's killed by Pyrrhus, Achilles' son, who goes on to found the kingdom of Epirus, which I hadn't realized. And Aeneas eventually flees Troy, carrying his father Anchises on his back, with his son Ascanius and with his wife Croesus, who they lose along the way. He goes back to try and find her, and he finds her ghost, and she's like, just leave, man, I'm dead. Get out while you can. So he flees with a whole bunch of the Trojans. They get on some ships and have sort of, not really an odyssey, but they stumble here and there trying to figure out where to go. They stop in Crete at one point, but eventually they end up on Sicily, where Anchises, Aeneas' father, dies of old age. They bury him, then they go a bit further and end up in Carthage. And this is where he explains to Dido all about the fall of Troy. Venus, for I can't remember the exact reason, gets her son Cupid to make Dido fall in love with Aeneas. And so they sort of get together. Dido claims that they're married. Dido had a husband who had died, and then someone else had tried to marry her, and she sort of like swore off marriage. So the fact that she's sort of falling for Aeneas is a big deal to her. But then Jupiter comes down and reminds Aeneas, hey, like, you're not supposed to stay in Carthage. You're supposed to found this place that will eventually become Rome. And so he sort of sneaks off with all of his ships. And Dido realizes that he's leaving, builds this huge funeral pyre, and lamenting, kills herself upon it. And as she's dying, swears eternal enmity between her line and the line of Aeneas, which is meant to sort of prophesy the Punic Wars of Carthage versus Rome. So Aeneas stops in Sicily again, where his father had been buried. It's been 1 year since his father died, and holds funeral games, which are very identical to the funeral games that were held in the Iliad, the funeral games of Patroclus. There's specifically one scene, the archery competition, where they tie a dove by its foot up to a mast and then try and shoot at it, and one person accidentally misses the dove and hits the line, cutting it, freeing the dove, and then the other competitor steps in and shoots the dove as it's flying away. That happens in the Iliad, and it happens identically in the Aeneid. There is a really cool competition, though, the boxing competition in the Aeneid, where this one sort of guy stands up and he volunteers for the boxing competition, and no one's willing to stand up and fight against him. So he sort of puts his hands on the bull, which would have been the prize for the competition, and says, well, if no one's gonna fight me, I'm just gonna take the bull. And then this sort of old grizzled boxer sort of stands up and he's like, man, if I was younger, I could beat you so bad, but fine, we'll fight. And they have a competition, and the old guy actually wins, beats the younger guy half to death. And then he grabs the bull and offers it as a sacrifice by punching the bull in its forehead and crushing its skull and killing it right then and there, which is just a crazy scene that, yeah, he wins this boxing competition and then he punches the bull in the face and kills it. Anyways, after the funeral games, they finally sail up and land on the coast of Latium. And there's a king there, Latinus, king of the Latins, who has this daughter Lavinia and this wife Amata. And there's been lots of prophecies that he should not offer his daughter's hand in marriage to any of the local rulers. He should wait for a foreigner to come, which is Aeneas. So Aeneas shows up, and Latinus is like, oh, well, here's the foreign prince. Great. I'm going to marry my daughter off to him, and it'll be great. However, there is a local ruler, Turnus, of the Rutuli, who was sort of promised the hand of Lavinia, or at least thought he was, and gets really upset about this. And Juno, up to her old tricks, because the gods are involved in all of this, sends Alecto down to stir up discontent and war, essentially, between these two peoples. And so Turnus, saying, like, just like Alexander came and took Helen away, now this other Trojan's coming and taking my wife Lavinia away. They're not married yet. It's war, it's on. And Latinus kind of like steps back, but Amata, his wife, is very much like, yeah, we're marrying our daughter to Turnus, not this foreign Aeneas guy. And this starts the sort of the Iliad component of the Aeneid, where we have a war between the Latins, the Rutuli, and Aeneas and the Trojans. And Aeneas goes to this nearby Greek, Evander, who's an older guy, and he's got the son Pallas, and recruits them to his cause. He also goes up and visits the Etruscans, gets some Etruscans on his side. So he's got like a decent contingent of people to attack these Latins. And while Aeneas is away getting these allies, Ormus attacks the Trojan encampment, where Ascanius, Aeneas' son, is there, and his son has to defend it. His son also goes by the name Iulus, which is supposedly because that's where the Iulii line, the sort of the Julian family came from, were descended from this guy Iulus. I don't know if that's just a thing they invented because of Julius Caesar and Caesar Augustus. But anyways, the Latins try to get some Greeks of their own. They actually go to Diomedes, famous hero from the Iliad, and try to get him on their side. But Diomedes sends a message where he's like, look, we had our Trojan War. We won. It's over. I don't hold anything against Aeneas. I'm not going to come help you. So the Latins are kind of on their own. And I'm going to be honest, the second part didn't really capture me as much as the first part. It felt like it sort of dragged on. It was very, very similar to the Iliad in terms of every character is named, everyone who dies is named, lots of metaphors. And it was stuff that I could recognize having read the Iliad just a few weeks ago, that like he's drawing heavily on the formula set down by Homer. And we do get some cool scenes of this, like these two Trojan young lovers who sneak off together into the Latin camp, but then they get killed. This one Latin virgin warrior, sort of Amazon, she's described as Camilla, who's sort of a queen of her own city and leads a bunch of Latins, but then gets killed. And so there's some cool characters and some cool moments moments. But of course, in the end, Zeus says to Juno, stop messing around. Look, it's destined that Aeneas is going to win and going to found Rome. You can't stop it. And Juno says, well, fine. Because Juno, remember, is against the Trojans right since the Iliad because of this competition where Paris/Alexander had chosen Venus over her. Anyways, Juno finally says, fine, the Trojans will win, but I want this future people that's a blending of the Trojans and the Latins. I want them to speak Latin, have Latin customs, have Latin names. I don't want any of the Trojan to be carried on. And Zeus says, okay, fine, I'll grant you that concession, which is sort of a weird way for the Romans to be like, yes, we're descended from the Trojans, but we still speak Latin and we're called the Latins and there's sort of no evidence of Trojanness in them. And so, yeah, we have a final 1v1 battle of Aeneas versus Turnus. And of course, Aeneas wins. And the epic ends with Aeneas defeating Turnus, Turnus saying like, okay, you win, just like grant me mercy, let me go free. And Aeneas is going to, but then he notices that Turnus has this sword belt that he had looted from the corpse of Pallas, the son of Evander, this sort of young, youthful warrior fighting on the side of Aeneas. And so Aeneas, in a rage, just stabs him through the heart and he dies. And it ends just like that. So yeah, the capstone to my sort of Homeric journey, even though it's not Homer at all. Beautiful language, but I found the second half just sort of dragged on. I was like, okay, I get it. Like, Aeneas has to conquer the Latins before he can join his people with them and eventually found Rome. But anyways, that's Virgil's Aeneid.